Thanks so much for being here. I'm Gabriella, by the way, and just good to meet you. And thank you
Nice to
especially
meet you.
for taking the time right now.
Of course.
Yeah, in the midst of the world. Um, oh, thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Um, so just Amanda, we're good to start.
Yes, you're all set to go.
Great. All right. Welcome, everybody. It's good to be together, and especially when there's a lot going on in the world, it's all the more so nice to be together and just be connected to those who are feeling really far but are really close to our hearts. So Yisrael, thank you for being here with us this morning. Today we're really doing an overview briefing of what's going on in Israel and Iran right now, making sure that we can all be as informed as possible. So thank you for joining Sinai Temple this morning. Or you're calling us not from morning time, but thank you.
It's
And
it's
first
my
I
pleasure.
just yeah,
No, my pleasure to be here, really.
thank you. And just to give everyone a little bit of context of who you are, because um we're really lucky to have you and to have you join us because one, more from a Sinai Temple perspective, a lot of people are asking me, well, what's Sinai Temple's connection to you? And like for the past 3 years, you've been the educator on the ground for part of the Sinai Temple Israel Center Rabbinical School Fellowship and really been that go-to person. You've worked with U.S. administration in educating government officials, and you've spent years being a leading voice for Israel education and Zionism for rabbis across denominations in North America. So that's, we feel really connected to you on that front. But you have an incredible bio, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just to give some highlights because you're right now you're a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, which is a Jerusalem-based think tank, and you've held the role of diaspora affairs advisor to the former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. And prior to that, you were working for APAC, doing director of strategic engagement, and you've really been able to be in all of these different, extremely tapped in parts of Israel Zionism, and we are so blessed to have you here today. So thank you for being here. And
Thank you,
uh,
Gabriella. It's my pleasure, and the sense of connection to Sinai Temple is completely mutual. I feel like I'm speaking to family right now, so this is great to be under the same roof,
like
virtual roof.
exactly. So I feel also just personally grateful because, and I think a lot of our community, there's so much going on and there's so much information coming to us. And something that is always helpful is really starting with that question of how did we get here? How did we get to this moment? And how did Thursday arrive? So that's what would be helpful is kind of just a larger overview of what brought us here, and then we'll
Sure.
jump into and what happened since then.
Sure. So, look, what I find to be helpful in trying to really unwrap and unravel what is layers of decades of formulations in a geostrategic reality that we are living through right now, uh, that right now is the culmination of all of that background, is to consider the following. We can always go way back in time, but I think the furthest back that I would like to go is, of course, the landmark of 1979 when the revolution takes place in Iran. And really, since then, it has become pretty clear to Israel that one of its major strategic obstacles in the region of the Middle East is stemming from Iran. And what started off as merely words and rhetoric slowly yet surely evolved into a highly sophisticated network of proxies. When I worked for Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, he would always give the imagery when we would meet with foreign delegations. He would always give the imagery of the octopus with tentacles. that the Iranian regime sitting in Tehran is the brain of the operation. They're sitting over there in the core center. But they're sending their arms, all these tentacles, all over the Middle East, utilizing what is their tactics for the larger strategy, which is finding these countries that are slowly disintegrating on their own and tapping into that already existing instability and just using Shiite proxies and forces to disseminate even further instability to the point of collapsed states, and then taking over those states for the sake of wreaking havoc in the region and spreading their revolutionary theology and ideology. What it led to is a tightening noose around Israel's neck, what is dubbed the Ring of Fire. So if we want to consider who these actors are, we're talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon, we're talking about the Shiite militias in Iraq, Syria, of course, before the recent developments of the fall of the Assad regime was very much taking orders and marching orders from the Iranians, and as well as some of the placed forces that were getting closer and closer to the southern border with Israel inside of Syria. We know the Houthis in Yemen sowing instability within the country, creating a civil war in Yemen, but also posing a serious existential threat to the Saudis. But in addition, as we found out soon after October 7th, that they would take part in the war as well. So really coming from every which direction, and the fear, like I said, that Israel always had was how to potentially deal with all of these threats at the same time. But more specifically and more poignantly, how do we deal with the brain of the operation when there are so many tentacles that are constantly creating these diversions or these distractions for Israel to immediately need to handle? And of course, I didn't mention very important proxies as well that are Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, including multiple terror cells inside the West Bank, as well as other sowing of instability inside of East Jerusalem in the Israeli-Palestinian population there. So really, we're talking about these threats coming from every which direction, and the equation that was created by Iran through their directive and through their long-term strategy of looking not 1 year, not 2 years, but like 10, 20, and 50 years down the line to build what ultimately, in their vision, would bring to the downfall of the only Jewish state and a complete wiping out of Israel. Um, what Israel feared would take place on October 7th, like I said, is that all of those fronts would converge on Israel at the same time. That is exactly what Yahya Sinwar had in mind. Luckily for Israel, he was acting, Yahya Sinwar acted, we now know, pretty much on his own volition, meaning he didn't fully coordinate. While we know that the Iranians certainly knew that there was a form of this plan that Yahya Sinwar carried out on October 7th. The timing of it, the exact timing of it, was very much Yahya Sinwar's own. It was his own marching orders, and therefore there was not this immediate convergence of all fronts at the very same time. The infamous seven fronts that Israel was always preparing itself and readying itself for in the doomsday scenario that I laid forward. Um, and uh, um, the way the war has unfolded since October 7th has really, in many ways, worked to Israel's favor because Israel was able to essentially isolate. We've obviously had simultaneous warfare on many fronts, but on a tactical level, to be able to silo and siphon off the different efforts in varying degrees, right? Choosing which front to focus on in a heavier manner, that has been the Israeli MO. And that was the case with when Israel preemptively struck Hezbollah as well, realizing that there needs to be a shift towards before there is any action taken on Iran, that Hezbollah is this massive hammer being held over Israel's head of Iran basically saying, don't do it, don't come to us, don't come to the brain because you know what's going to happen if you do. And that is the full utilization of our major proxy in the region, which at the time had roughly 150,000 rockets and missiles, some of which can hit with exact precision anywhere in Israel. And that's what Israel feared. But when Israel diminished Hezbollah's capabilities to basically to the point of not recognizing that major Middle Eastern power from before to what it is today, that opened a lot of doors for Israel. And now, fast forwarding to where we are pretty much today, or before, prior to Israel's preemptive strike on Iran, um, there was more and more intelligence that Israel was receiving, both, I would say, overt intelligence by way of the IAEA coming out with their report and basically spelling out to the world that this is imminent and that the Iranian ability to break out towards a bomb is very, very short. Um, in addition to Israel's own intelligence assessment, and I would say what I've read since then and have seen is that even those doomsday assessments that the Israelis had were relatively uh, um, they were selling it short, right? It was actually worse, and Iran was way closer than many people thought or believed it to be. And it pushed Israel to take that decision of unilateral action, and I think we're going to get to some of the questions of how unilateral it was, but to act on its own and ensure that in fact Israel's longstanding what's called the Begin Doctrine of Menachem Begin saying way back then in the 70s and 80s that no country that poses a credible threat towards Israel, no enemy of Israel in the region, should be allowed by Israel to possess nuclear capability. And that's what we did, of course, in Syria. That's what we did with Iraq. So we were well acquainted with how to do these things. And fast forwarding again to where we are right now, which is in unbelievable effort by the Israelis to essentially completely wipe out the Iranian anti-aircraft operation. So they had what's called the Russian S-300 system, which was considered a relatively sophisticated way to shoot down planes in the sky. But we bypassed that both in previous operations to this one, but certainly in everything that transpired in the last week or so. And in addition to that, we took out the assessment rate now is around 14 or 15 of Iran's top nuclear scientists. Mossad put together one of the most incredible. I mean, we keep saying this sentence because they keep outdoing themselves, but in an incredible operation of putting together a factory of building drones on Iranian soil very close to where the radar systems of the Iranians were to ensure that they're being jammed essentially, and not able to detect Israeli aircraft as they make their way and take out strategic targets, including some of the missile launchers. The assessment is that we took out more than a third of those. The actual stockpile. The list goes on and on. I don't think we shouldn't spend our
Yeah.
time on
So
that,
that
but
so
yeah,
that's a really helpful overview of kind of what was happening in the region and Iran's role in all of this before last week. And you're
yeah,
kind of, getting into now, okay, and I say week, but it's like it hasn't even been a week. Like what
yeah,
what then happened Thursday? What was that turning point, and what are we seeing these past few days?
sure. So, look, one of the most strategic breakthroughs that Israel has accomplished is essentially having a total air superiority over Iran. So Israel's F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, these are highly sophisticated weapons systems that are now operating freely over the skies and able to work on, as I mentioned, some of the strategic targets that Israel has set forth for. I mean, we've been planning this for years now. So this is no surprise to the Israeli military or intelligence or Mossad. They've all been not just read in, but very readied for this moment, including, by the way, the Home Front Command in Israel, in readying itself for what is going to be the counteroffensive of the Iranians, indiscriminately targeting civilians with their ballistic missiles, and making sure that we have enough stockpiles of, for example, the Arrow. Right, we have a three-tier missile defense system. Most important for the Iranian missile capabilities that are coming from that far away is the Arrow longer range interceptors. So having enough of those to keep them, and even that, as we've seen, has not been a foolproof plan. Um, but taking out the know-how of how to put together in the future a new nuclear program that has been essential for what Israel is trying to accomplish here in setting back Iran's ambitions as much as humanly possible. The other thing I would say is taking out the leadership. Of course, there's a hope that isn't a top objective of this military campaign, which is that with taking out the leadership of the Ayatollahs, and their military leadership, that might be an opening for an uprising from within that would hopefully overthrow this dictatorial regime. But the other thing that Israel is trying to do and trying to accomplish, that it's already started to do to a varying degree, is to take out the actual nuclear capabilities. Iran has been very sophisticated in how they built out this program over many years, essentially compartmentalizing the nuclear program into many different sites with different taking into account that each site will be able to sort of build up in the future if hit. Right. So if one goes down, the other can operate on a somewhat independent way and have a path forward to the bomb anyways. And I would say the most fortified that I'm sure everybody here has already heard of is Fordo. And the question that was always asked prior to this Israeli attack was, can Israel take out the Iranian nuclear program on its own? And it wasn't clear, right? The question was specifically about this site in Fordo that is way deep down, 60 meters in fortified concrete underneath the ground. And the only country in the world that has the equipment to penetrate that level of depth and concrete fortification is the United States, that has these bunker busters that can go and can only be dropped from a very specific aircraft, and that is the B-2 bomber, which Israel doesn't have as well. So the question was, will the U.S. join in this effort? And if not, can Israel carry out this mission alone? And if the answer to Israel not being able to carry out the mission alone, is it worthwhile going off on this endeavor anyways? So I'll leave it with question marks because it still doesn't seem like there's a clear answer to any of these questions. Um, Both on the front of whether or not the United States is going to step in a major way or in an active way with either supplying those bombs or actually carrying out the attack. I'm sure you're following closely the news in the United States that it seems schizophrenic by the minute, right? We keep hearing different things coming out of the U.S. administration. One time it's we're going to go back to the table and potentially uh, um, heed to the calls of the Ayatollahs to come back to the negotiating table, and the next minute it's we're not averse to actually stepping into action here. So I think
And right, and who knows? And
we have yet to see where the pendulum will swing towards ultimately, but what I would say is regardless of the answer to that. I think what we can read into or analyze is the fact that Israel did choose to do this on its own, not knowing whether or not the US was going to take an active role. I think that should give, at the very least, a hint to what Israel thinks it could accomplish.
Mhm.
And I'm sure everybody can understand what I'm alluding to. The speculation is, or some of the scenarios I would say that people discuss when thinking about how Israel could accomplish it without those bombs is, for example, could it be a ground operation that is able to penetrate into that site? There are other scenarios that people conjure up, but again, it's a little bit speculative at this point.
So just to clarify, I think that for a lot of Americans, it seemed for a while that Israel was acting totally alone. And then over the
Yeah.
last few days, there's not as much clarity about what the US knew about or had a role in. And could you just clarify for us where that stands and where
Sure.
the
Yeah,
US stands in this?
I knew we were going to get here, which is why I didn't completely
Yeah, yeah,
unravel
absolutely.
that picture. But I think it's pretty incredible when we think about it because um, there was one of the ways in which Israel was able to carry out was what was a surprise attack that shouldn't necessarily have been a surprise attack to the Iranians given the fact that Trump gave them a 60-day ultimatum from the beginning of negotiations until the point where he's fed up with attempted negotiations, and we were at day 61. So again, shouldn't necessarily have been a surprise, but what the US and Israel looks like we're doing in cahoots is this really deceptive ploy to fool the Iranians and lull them into believing that there is a continuation of negotiations and to lull them into believing that the US is deterring Israel in the most uh, um, extreme terms not to attack Iran because they want to keep the negotiations alive. I mean, this ploy went wide and far to the point where thousands of people were in the know in Israel, but kept it secret. Where they people in decision-making capacities were playing a part in this theater of selling the Iranians that the Israelis are really worried about what Iran is going to do and are trying to apply pressure on the U.S. So, as an example of that, Ron Dermer, the minister of the cabinet in Israel, the security cabinet in Israel, was supposed to go to the U.S. And speak to his counterparts in the administration to try to walk them back from their vetoing Israel from going continuing on along the attack path. Um, there are many other clues into how wide and deep this deception went, but I think clearly it worked out quite well. And the Iranians were indeed caught completely off guard. I think the one of the questions that sort of remains now, actually, I'll phrase this a little differently, which is by creating that deception the US and specifically President Trump, it's pretty clear that he's the one calling the shots, pretty much by himself at this point, that he is positioned in the best way possible right now. That Israel essentially handed him on a silver platter one of two great options from his vantage point. Either there is a great victory that he's going to take part in in one way or another in maybe toppling the Iranian regime, or at the very least, throwing back the Iranian capacity and ability to build up nuclear arms by many, many years, or win a Nobel Prize, which he has spoken about out loud time and again, and go about it from this point on through a diplomatic route, but with the Iranians coming to the table at a really, really weakened, out of a really weakened position, essentially without any bargaining chips or strength. So that's a great position for him to be in. I mean, we see it now. He's sort of basking in that position by throwing around every once in a while. Oh, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Let's keep everybody on their heels. That does bode well for him and for his standing. I will say one more thing, which is what I see in internal American polling on the support for, if it is true that Iran was indeed breaking out towards nuclear capability, that there is pretty wide support for Trump taking the position of, we need to take an active role here. Um, I know and am aware that he has a part of his base that Tucker Carlson is representing that is very much against that, as well as the far progressive left that is taking up the same position. Shocker that they found common ground on this issue. But that is something that I think he can work around, meaning those dissenting voices are there's enough of a base, a wide enough base for him to lean on in making that decision at this moment in time.
Yeah. Um, that's kind of this larger overview and gives us a really helpful idea of what's going on. Where does Israel stand? What are their goals? And where does the US sit in that, even though there's also so much uncertainty of where the US might sit in all of this.
Yeah,
Could you give us a little bit of an insight into what's the on the ground for Israelis right now? What does
sure.
that look like? And you're calling us from Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Yeah.
And yeah, what is that day to day looking like right now?
So first of all, my kids have been at home for the past week or so, right? That this has been the case for all Israeli children, no schools. Um, it's Israel is a fascinating country. This should not be news to the Sinai Temple family. Um, I'll share my own experience, my personal story of October 7th, which is that I was living in Pittsburgh when October 7th hit. My wife was doing a postdoctoral fellowship in ophthalmology in UPMC, and she understood right away what I wanted to do, which is go back and serve with my special forces friends who were already getting geared up to head in. And we made a decision in real time that I would get back on the first flight that I can get and come back and fight alongside them, which is exactly what happened. She stayed with our kids. We have four kids. Stayed with them in Pittsburgh for the initial 3 months, but once I was moved together with my unit to Khan Yunis in Gaza, my family and I made the decision together that they would come back and pack up and come back to Israel. This is what we saw now with Israelis. There were roughly 150 or 200,000 Israelis outside the country when this preemptive strike on Iran began, and there was this massive rush to come back to a war zone. It's an incredible thing that can't really be explained. I think there's, even with the internal divides and rifts that are real, that are difficult, and that everybody struggles through. When push comes to shove, Israelis stand shoulder to shoulder, and there's this tribal effect that is very much one of a family that wants to be there for one another when the going gets tough. So that's what we saw when this began. Um, and the other thing I would say is, look, BB's coalition was faltering, and there were already not just hints, it was pretty clear that they weren't going to survive due to the draft bill much longer. So maybe a month from now is what we were speaking about in terms of when we would need to head to or at least break apart the coalition and start getting ready for next elections. Um, and a lot of people feared and were voicing that this is one of Bibi's his way out of that political predicament is to go to war with Iran. Um,
Can
but
can I
what's
just
sure,
so that we're all on the same page, can you actually just give a couple sentences, context for the Haredi draft bill? Just,
sure, yeah,
so we're
absolutely,
all,
yeah. So this is
because I think that, yeah,
uh,
absolutely plays
yeah.
into
Since of course
where
you're
the
right,
Israeli
you're
government
correct. Since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister and leader of Israel, decided that there would be an exemption for the ultra-Orthodox community, given that there was a need for the ultra-Orthodox community to sort of silo off. So in Hebrew, the name for ultra-Orthodox is Haredi. The root of that word is chared, which means fearful. And what they're fearful is of integrating into larger Israeli society and secularizing in a way that they don't want to see for their youth and their next generations. And therefore, they build all these fences to ensure that that doesn't happen. And one of the biggest fears for them, by way of integrating into larger Israeli society, is through the Israeli military, the melting pot of Israeli society. And that is something that's been in place and sort of, I would say, accepted by Israeli society for many, many years, even though it was seen as unfair and there were many other issues with it, but still, people could live with it. But then came October 7th. And that changed everything. There was an acute need for more boots on the ground. And as there were more soldiers killed, the fact that nobody else saw fit to actually join in the effort and to say, let's set aside these ideals that we have for the sake of saving our country, that came to a front and to a head, and Bibi's coalition, which is leaning on the ultra-Orthodox parties, would have disintegrated should Bibi say that he's going to take care of this problem once and for all and make sure that they are drafted. So that was the predicament that Bibi found himself in, and that's why the government was faltering to the point of collapse. I would say more specifically, it was about to collapse because this is the last year before elections are held anyways, and therefore the ultra-Orthodox community and their political leadership knew that this is the time with the most amount of leverage that they have to apply on Netanyahu to put together a bill that would put to rest the constant attempts to draft them. So that's what was at play. Bringing that back to the conversation of where this found Netanyahu during prior to his preemptive strike on Iran, I'll just say that there were many people, like I mentioned, that were fearful in Israel that this would be one of Bibi's only tools left to keep that coalition afloat. And while I would say that even if that is true, and probably is, but even if it is true, there is wall-to-wall agreement in Israel that a preemptive strike on Iran is of the utmost need, and it is crucial for this future survival of the state of Israel. So just to clarify this point, Israel has for many years, right, with this tightening of the noose that I described before, and the octopus continuing to spread its tentacles in more severe ways, Israel understood that, well, the way Israel dealt with it essentially was by kicking the can down the road and dealing with small tactical problems one at a time, but never really going to the source because they always felt like they couldn't, and that the price would be too high, and whatever the other reasons are, and there were plenty always, that just was not in the cards until October 7th. And when October 7th hit, Israelis, again, I'm saying this by and large and almost wall to wall, looked at the situation around us and said, this is just no longer feasible. To have a Hezbollah on our doorsteps with the capacity to carry out a five-fold attack of October 7th is just not something we're willing to live with anymore. And to have Iran continue to maintain their capacity to rebuild those very same capabilities, even if we kick that can down the road 5 years from now, that's just not sustainable, and that's not something we're willing to stand for anymore. So that really was a paradigm shift and changed the way Israelis viewed the geostrategic long-term viability of where Israel stands in the fray. And that is something that all politicians, right, even Bibi's adversaries, have now joined forces and said, we're with you, do what you got to do. Israelis from left and right, I've seen some posts from the harshest critics of Netanyahu. I'm talking about the harshest, that say, go do what you got to do. We're with you, shoulder to shoulder.
Thank you. So, I think one, and you started to talk about kind of this link between October 7th and
Yeah.
now. And I think that there's a big question here about priorities. And something that also you had mentioned was that Israel's been really good at focusing on one area, whether it was, throughout the war, this past year and a half, focusing on the north or focusing on parts of Gaza. And now the focus is on Iran, it seems.
Yep.
So what does this mean, though, for Gaza, for
Yep.
and also for the hostages, which has been this huge focus. And in the past week and a half, or not even week and a half, 5 days, whatever,
Yeah.
time seems so warped. Of where does that stand now? And what does that mean for priorities of Israel?
Yeah. Look, it's I'll add to your question
Yeah,
if I may, that I think one of the perplexing realities is how could it be that Hamas was able to carry out such a low-tech, successful, massive attack on Israel, and here we are, the same Israel that failed to defend its own citizens living along the border is now carrying out the most incredible warfare thousands of kilometers away, and doing it successfully, like I said. I think that question sort of feeds into yours and vice versa. What I'll say is this. First off, I have to say that so long as our now remaining 53 hostages are not home, there is a massive missing piece to the puzzle, and that the Israeli heart, the Israeli trauma will live on in ways that I think we have yet to really uncover and truly understand. Um, that the ability to turn around or turn the page and begin a healing process that we so desperately need, that's just not there. And yes, everything is linked. Everything is intertwined. I started off by mentioning that the tentacles that Hamas is a part of.
Yeah.
It's all coming from Iran, right? So Iran was giving roughly 50% of Hamas's funding was coming directly from them, a lot of the know-how. And that is, of course, attributable to them. However, what we're seeing is that the question of how to deal with a problem that is at home, that is basically within your borders, is a much more difficult question, right? Similar to how people and so many people around the world try to do this, to oversimplify the question of the West Bank as if that is an easy one. Well, Israel, why don't you just stop occupying? Simple. Well, obviously it's not simple, right? When you begin to understand the weight and gravity of these threats and just how real they are and not imagined in any way. And once you understand the topography and geography of the tiny little waistband of the state of Israel and the watershed line of the mountain ridge that crosses Israel north to south, aka the West Bank, that holds strategic ground over and power in height over Israel's 90% of Israel's industrial capacity and 50% of Israel's population in what's called the Gush Dan area of Greater Tel Aviv. You start to understand that there's a very difficult and complicated picture that isn't as simple as, well, if you just leave, everything will be okay. Um, and Gaza, like we're in the same predicament that Israel was back in the Oslo Accords days, right? When Israel set off on the path to say, let's see if there's a more viable way for Palestinians to self-govern and take full ownership over their own destiny. That back then that was seen as something that's worthwhile and you can take that kind of risk. I think looking at that situation today, those risks look much less appealing than ever before. Certainly with regards to the West Bank, but I would say that the same goes for the Gaza Strip. So in asking the question of what to do in what is Israel's exit strategy? How do we end this war? How do we ensure that the hostages get back home safely? I think I do not envy in the least the decision
Yeah.
makers in Israel. This is a very difficult position to be in. Um, I oftentimes highlight the fact that Israelis' call to end the war in Gaza is very different than American and other Western countries' calls to end the war in Gaza. Because if given the decision or if given the option of getting all the hostages back for the price that Hamas wants us to pay, which is a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and allowing them essentially to continue and maintain rulership over that swath of land, that Israel would say yes to that. But if given the option, right, merely because we are prioritizing the hostages above any other objective,
Right.
but if given the option of saying, well, as a next step, all we have to do is wait for a misstep on Hamas's part to go right back in and continue the operation to annihilate Hamas and ensure that they are no longer posing a credible threat to Israel from here on out, that is what Israelis would choose to do.
Mhm.
Uh, you can't say the same about some of the calls to end the war from the international community because it's coming from a very different place. And that's there's a very significant gap there that I think is definitely noteworthy.
Absolutely. And I'd say, we don't know how we can't know how everything will play out, but I'm definitely curious in this moment of how this focus on Iran shifts the broader community's understanding of what Gaza is really about and what role.
I'm not hopeful on that front.
Not hopeful, but
But no,
know,
but I'll tell you where I am hopeful. I am hopeful.
and this might be a good place. I'm just looking at our time.
Yeah.
I would love to hear what you're hopeful about. And for myself, for everyone. Um, And we just have a few minutes left, so maybe also just to give us some closing ideas. I know there's so many more questions. We can spend hours and hours
Sure.
understanding the situation. Um, but
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll maybe I'll get to the closing remarks after I say one of the things that I'm hopeful for with regard, and this may not sound hopeful to some of our viewers, but I think it is, and that is that the way the world order has worked historically and continues to work. If anybody's looking closely enough, they'll see this picture, is that it's mostly not about ideals. It's about a realpolitik of who is in a position of strength, who has the right amount of leverage at a given moment in time, and what you leverage that for. And to that question, I think this move by Israel vis-a-vis the Iranians or the Iranian regime, right? We have to make that clear distinction between, and Israel is making it very clear that it's not about the Iranians. The opposite is true. We want the Iranian people freed, and hopefully this brings them there. But this is about the Iranian regime. That by creating a brand new dynamic in the Middle East and weakening what was a significant power that has sucked up much of the energy and oxygen of Middle Eastern politics for so long, holding not only over Israel's head, but also what's called the Sunni axis in the region, over the Saudis, over the Gulf states, a lot of these states that are looking to modernize and shift to being much more, I would say, pro-Western than ever before. That this allows them to do that. That not only does it allow them to do that on the front of the moderate Sunni Arab countries, but also in terms of some of these other Western countries that have since soon after the war waged on Hamas have turned on Israel and looked at only one side of the equation, which is the unfortunate toll of innocent Palestinian civilians, which I'll say very clearly is very, very unfortunate and sad and tragic and awful. But in the same breath, right, Israel knew this to be what they were up against because this is exactly what is playing to Hamas's hands and what they want to show to the world, which is the big bad evil Israel that will stop at nothing to indiscriminately attack. And when in fact it's the exact opposite. It is very, very pinpointed. But there's no way around it. There are going to be casualties in a war of this manner, and like I said, it's a tragedy. But it was very clear that these Western states would turn on Israel. But what I see is that this is one of the only things that could potentially, meaning the now changing reality with the deterioration of the Iranian regime and their ability to hold over other countries, that provides Israel with newfound leverage over many of the European countries as well, to if for any other reason but realpolitik to actually come closer and back into the sphere, the stratosphere of the Israelis. So that's sounds a little bit like a backhanded compliment, but it is.
no,
Um,
we'll take what we can get right now.
exactly. Um, Closing remarks. Uh, Look, I think that like it feels silly to say since October 7th because we've used this term ad nauseum at this point of the historical events, right? We're at this pinnacle of where things are at. I, I think it's true to say that in this case, and it's not hyperbole at all. To see what has transpired, if we're looking back, like I said, in the beginning of my talk, of this long, meticulous, well thought out plan, malicious plan to wreak havoc around the Middle East, around the globe, but essentially to create an existential threat surrounding Israel. That if you look at that threat right now, it is so far off from where it was but a year and a half, a little over a year and a half ago. That I think should give many people cause for hope, and I'll give my 2 cents of what I'm hopeful for, which is peace. I hope and pray, and I've always said that if the threats weren't so plentiful, if Israel didn't constantly feel like it needs to live on its sword, which is an unfortunate place to be in. And if you want to really dig into the psyche of Israelis and why Bibi continues to get reelected, that's chief amongst those reasons. If there is no longer a desperate sense of the imminent threat that is right around the corner that Israel desperately needs to thwart and work tirelessly to fight off and stave off. That is what allows Israel to deal with the things that it should be dealing with, like the internal rifts, the very raw division that exists inside of Israeli society, be it the judicial reform that was very front and center up until October 7th, and then soon after came back in with a vengeance. The draft bill, which we mentioned, the gap in income inequality in Israel, which is amongst the highest in the world. The cost of living, of course. There's so many, the list just goes on, and those are crucial things for Israel to really figure out. Not to mention the ideological and identity related divisions that have to do much more with and this goes back to the question of what Israel fears, which has to do with what do you identify more as? Do you see yourself more on the side of the Jewish equation of Jewish and democratic, or more on the side of democratic? And where are you pulling towards in that ever evolving tension between the two? And again, those are things we desperately need to get back to discussing and dealing with in a real way. And the other thing I would say is that um, right, like those are the types of things that once we do have the capacity and time and space and lack of trauma to be able to step into, that we can then get to deal in peace and not constantly think about, well, if we try this, aren't we stepping into a new ring of fire that is going to be held over our heads for God knows how long? And like I said, I hope and pray that we get to that point soon. And I think that this is a beginning of a stepping stone in the right direction, because it's peace through strength. That's really what we need: internal and external peace through strength.
Thank you.
Of
And
course.
thank you, Israel. I know we can spend a lot more time unpacking this. And look, in the next few weeks, we'll see what more needs to be unpacked. And so thank you so much. We
Yeah, yeah. By tomorrow, there should be a brand new briefing on this topic.
exactly. But thank you, and thank you again for joining us from Jerusalem. I know it's late, and but we really appreciate it, and it is so helpful for our community, and we feel really connected to you. So thank you.
Thank you. And like I said, the feeling is completely mutual. And I want to thank your community, especially for being such a vocal and proud supporter of the state of Israel, and really that the sense that this is a brother and sisterhood that really is family linked more than anything else with specifically with your community is palpable. So really an incredible sense, and I feel proud to be part of this mishpacha, this family.
Thank you. Well, have a good rest of your evening.
Thank
Thank you
you. Thank
everyone
you.
for joining
You
us,
too.
and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.